Hi everyone, it's been a while. I've been on the road for the past few weeks in Southeast Asia and Australia. Wonderful to connect with people in person. And a quick note about plans for the coming years. I'm going to spend a good amount of time in Europe in 2026, Stockholm in February, Paris in March, and then Greece for the retreat in August, the solar eclipse retreat in this amazing island that happened to be the ancestral land of Atlantis next to Santorini. So, a lot is going on in the sky, and I wanted to take this time to unpack some of it. We are ahead of this next grand trine in water. So Jupiter is at 25 Cancer, Saturn is at 25 Pisces, close to Neptune, of course. And then the Sun is at 25 Scorpio on November 17. Soon after, Venus will also complete this grand trine as it reaches those late Scorpio degrees. So, what is this all about? I want to plug in the fact that I've written a whole article on this Jupiter Saturn trine. It's now in water signs, but in the course of 2026, Jupiter is going to move into Leo, Saturn in Aries. So the trine will repeat in fire signs. I've written an article about this that will be published very soon in the Time Lords magazine from the Cosmic Intelligence Agency. So you can check my website. You'll be able to check my Facebook group, Evolutionary Skies, where we share a lot of free information and study astrology. So what is this grand trine about? Remember that when we look at any aspect between planets, we have to go back to the seeding time of the conjunction. So the new cycle of Jupiter and Saturn began December 2020 at 0 Aquarius. And now, as Jupiter moves faster than Saturn, it keeps forming those different aspects from the semi-sextile to the sextile to the square, and now the trine. So we are in the trine phase of this initial conjunction. And this conjunction was very powerful because it's the first one in a series to be in the air signs. So Jupiter, Saturn meet every 20 years, and it's usually in the same element for about 200 years consecutive. So now it's going to be it was in Aquarius 2020, it's going to be in Libra 2040, it's going to be in Gemini 2060. So it keeps repeating in air signs. But what is it all about? I mean, Jupiter and Saturn are our teachers. They are the moral compass, how we function, not just as individual, but as a society. And that also means what kind of cultural conditioning, what have we been taught by society, by our parents, by our teachers, to be right and wrong. So everywhere you go on the planet, if you live in the desert, if you live in the jungle, if you live in the polar region, the interpretation of right and wrong can vary. Because the climate and environmental circumstances can affect your conditions and your life conditions. But generally speaking, Jupiter and Saturn represents also the moral rights and wrong. Where do we get that? We get it from spiritual sources, from our Quran and Bibles and Bhagavad Gitas, and we are inspired by spiritual wisdom to try to figure out how to lead this life. Jupiter and Saturn are, in a way, our compass, our directional compass, and our moral compass. So when they come together, there's usually a shift of leadership because we see who are the ones we can trust, who bring wisdom and who can guide us forward. So we're going to unpack that trine phase in the article, but I'm just going to touch on brief events that are occurring as this takes place so we can reflect this on our own life. So because they represent those guidelines, and Jupiter and Saturn are our teachers, right? Spiritual teacher and human teachers, they also represent controversy. When they come together, not only do we have a rotation of leadership, but we also have new debates about what's wrong and what's right. So it's not uncommon to have ethical questions, ethical debates. Who is right and wrong? And of course, this affects leadership. So, is it a coincidence that as this trine is forming, we have these huge ethical debates and controversies emerging in the zeitgeist? Number one, the Epstein files. How is that managed? The Trump administration is delaying the release, weaponizing this whole thing, and people, the more you try to hide, the more they want to know, obviously. So trying to kind of dilute this and make it seem like it's no big deal makes it even more of a big deal. It's a natural reaction that when you try to hide something, it means we need to be informed. So that is, one component of this controversy. But then, you know, recently, this journalist, attorney, mother of three teenagers, Megyn Kelly, who is a big MAGA supporter, comes on her shows and speaks about the fact that maybe Epstein was not really a pedophile because he was into barely legal 15, 14-year-olds, not into infants. So imagine if her daughters were the targets, right? So suddenly now she softens her tone and tries to dilute the gravity of what this whole Epstein enterprises was. And of course, it's politically motivated, but it brings again this question about ethics, what's right and wrong. Suddenly, we try to normalize having sex with teenagers. It's not that bad. So, how did we get to this point, right? Megyn Kelly herself has a Saturn in Taurus opposing Jupiter in Scorpio. These are sexual signs. So all this matter of ethics, guidance, what's right and wrong applies in her case to Taurus Scorpio themes of sexuality and of course financial dealings as well. So down the road, we may not only see controversies about what she thinks about pedophiles and how she tries to downplay the whole thing, but maybe financial dealings, maybe there will be ethical considerations about that. Another thing that comes to mind is how Trump is really reaching out, going out of his personal comfort zone to try to pardon Benjamin Netanyahu, who is accused of corruption in Israel. not for the war in Gaza, but for financial dealings and using his position um, to gain favors. He bought, a publications leader to try to sway public opinion in his favor. So he was basically bribing, this the, this head of a mega media empire in Israel, and others, indiscretion where he received $300,000 in gifts and whatnot. So these are financial issues and abuse of power to sway, elections and public opinion in his favor. And so Trump is, reaching out to the president of Israel, who has the power to pardon Netanyahu, the prime minister. And so again, is it right or wrong? Are you going to pardon a criminal? And what about the more significant charges of abuse of power and crimes, war crimes? So all this surfaces during this trine and prompting us to ask questions. What is right and wrong? Which side do we stand on? And are we sticking to principles of integrity um, as we navigate, political landscapes, public opinion? And that can not only apply on a political level, but on a personal level. What's happening in our own lives? Where do we need to step up as leaders? And what about our own integrity? An interesting and positive example, I would say, as this happens, is another politician in the United States, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is now criticizing Trump for his foreign policy and for not putting America first. And if you compare Marjorie Taylor Greene with Megyn Kelly, who are both in the same camp, you see how Marjorie Taylor Greene is willing to defy authority because she's consistent with her principles. So she passes here a test of integrity in really standing up for her principles, not for political affiliation. So Saturn, Jupiter, trine, square, whatever it is, are our moral compass. Earlier on, 2024 and 2020, early 25, they were in a square when Jupiter was in Gemini and Saturn in Pisces. And that is when Trump um, ordered ICE to deport illegal immigrants. So Jupiter has to do with immigration. Saturn has to do with the rule of law. So the Saturn-Jupiter square was about stopping the bleeding at the borders and trying to reinstate, a policy of law and order, Jupiter-Saturn. But then controversy emerges when they start deporting people wrongly, people who have their papers in order. And then the brutality of arresting people, dragging them down on the street, and people going through heart attacks, separated from their families, having their kids torn from them. This kind of atrocious procedure for a good reason. It's just the execution, is wrong. Jupiter, Saturn, it's wrong. You don't do it this way. So you see how this Jupiter Saturn is evolving in all kinds of different contexts and different realities, and how we are each needing to stand up to some of these tests and be and test our own integrity. So later, in a few days, Venus is going to reach those degrees and is going to complete this grand trine. And you can bet that there are going to be questions about money, Venus, relationships, um, fidelity and infidelities, violations of trust, and sexual boundary issues because it's in Scorpio. What you can also find during this time is how Jupiter in Cancer um, is, on the one hand, amplifying the tribal connection with your country, with your family. Cancer has to do with your roots and ancestry. But Jupiter in Cancer also brings a debate about integrity, ethics, ideologies within the tribe and the family. So I've seen in the past few months since Jupiter got into Cancer, how instead of unifying families, it's actually causing splits, disputes, disagreement, and even separations in the family because there are divergence in our belief system. So Jupiter has to do with our integrity and what we believe to be right or wrong. And suddenly, if we suddenly feel that our family is siding with something that's wrong, can we support that? Can we just brush it under the rug? Do we need to debate, to talk about it? So this is when politics can enter family dynamics. So Jupiter in Cancer brings a lot of these debates in the family, and it can actually divide families, just the way it can divide a nation. Read this article on my website about Jupiter in Cancer and the return of female wisdom. It's interesting to see that since Jupiter got into Cancer, three women, the Prime Minister of Japan, first woman to ever lead Japan, um, President of Ireland, Catherine Connolly, and then Maria Corina from Venezuela, who has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So these women are ideologically very different. So it's not about what kind of belief system you have or what type of leadership, but it's about the fact that women are rising to power and they are going to face their own test of integrity. So are we having a return of soft power with Jupiter in Cancer? Or are we betraying our values of compassion, of support system, of taking care of the vulnerable? So all these water grand trine have to do with how we get in touch with vulnerability. So another example is during the US shutdown, as the budget was frozen and many workers, were kept out of work, furloughed. So we suddenly realized that those who are the most vulnerable, those who need access to healthcare, those who need food stamps, were caught in the middle of that political battle. That's very much a water grand trine situation because water has to do with the vulnerable, with those who need a support system. And that is not only those out there, it's also questioning our own vulnerability, where any of us needs help. any of us needs to reach out. So see how that affects your own ethical consideration, your own judgment patterns, how you look at vulnerability. When you see someone in need, do you kick them in the groin, right? Or do you try to assist? Do what is happening with compassion with this grand trine? So, a lot to consider. Another component to take into consideration, Mars is now in the sign of Sagittarius. It's going to square the nodes late November, and the nodes are in Pisces, Virgo, which have to do with employment. And we see a crisis in employment because there are not enough workers for agriculture. Um, a lot of people are losing their jobs. So Mars in Sagittarius can actually perhaps give a boost, can actually create new opportunities, but it can also prompt people to move because Sagittarius has to do with relocation, with international opportunities. So people may lose their job in one country and may want to migrate to another country for better opportunities. There may be, again, ideological. Sagittarius has to do with ideologies, ideological considerations that affect work dynamics. Then later in the game, as Mars moves to the late degrees of Sagittarius, around the first couple of weeks of December, it's going to square Saturn and then Neptune in Pisces. So we go back to that whole concept of integrity, of ethical considerations, of controversies. But a Mars Saturn has a lot to do with defying authorities. Mars is the defiance, Saturn is the authority. But it is also about how the authority can abuse force, Mars. Commonly, Saturn Mars aspect have a military flavor to them. Many military conflicts are starting or are amplified during a Mars Saturn. So, Vladimir Putin has his Mars at 26 Sagittarius. So he's going to have a Mars return squaring his Saturn and Pallas Athena. You are going to hear about him. We are going to hear about Ukraine, Russia, hopefully not escalating, but it is very precarious. It could derail, it could lead to new accusations. And of course, a lot of tension is building up around Venezuela and the United States advancing warship, in the borders of Venezuela, which of course is an oil reserve, and there's a lot of goodies there. And the same Nobel Peace activist who was nominated for peace, Maria Corina, has met with the Trump administration to speak about, the day after, when possibly the existing regime is going to be toppled. Now, Venezuela is a mess. And so we can understand that international intervention is maybe in order. However, the question is, how is it done? What are the true incentives? Do we want to help Venezuelan or do we want their oil? And then the question also is controversies around the way the administration is shooting boats coming out of Venezuela without really due process, um, alleging that these are drug mules, so to speak, that are transporting drugs to the United States and they need to be stopped. So again, a lot of good ideas to stop the drugs, to stop immigration. The big problem is that we're facing with this Saturn Jupiter is the execution. How do we reach our goals if we have worthy targets? Do the actions justify, do those means justify the actions, right? Can we just do anything because we have, a holy purpose? So, a quick update. Thank you for listening and check those resources.